So we're going to shift our focus a little bit and talk about using supervision wisely. When I'm speaking specifically about this supervision, I'm talking mostly about that hour a week that you are spending with your student. Regardless of whether or not you are an MSW field instructor or a task supervisor, you should be spending this hour a week with your student uninterrupted as much as possible to be able to devote that time to the student and to processing. Here we are reviewing some of the basic topics that are discussed during that hour a week or more that you're spending with your student. Initially, there are some specific items that should be reviewed, and then you have continuous items that are going to go throughout the practicum that you will discuss. We spoke about this a little bit in the first recording regarding setting expectations. It's important that you review expectations early on with the student. The earlier you set these and the more specific your expectations are, the less difficulty or misunderstanding or miscommunications you may have later on. Initially, it's important to discuss how you're going to set the agenda for your supervision. Will the student do that? Will you do that? Will it be a group effort? What do you expect the student to bring each week to supervision? When will you have the supervision? What day and what time? Where will that be held? And again, what you expect the student to bring with him or her when supervision occurs. Clarifying the boundaries and the rules, again, early in the practicum, so there are no issues around that topic later on. Making sure that the student knows that you are the supervisor, that there will likely be no social situations or friend type situations with the student, that there is that power differential there and you need to maintain that. That the student also maybe needs to go through you for everything, or maybe can go through you or one other person for assignments, but being sure to clarify what those roles are. Making sure that the student doesn't go above you to your boss, maybe without your permission, etc. Whatever boundaries you want to set up and what those roles are, and letting the student know what his or her role is and the upper limits of his or her independence, etc. And being very specific about that. If you're not available, maybe as the field instructor or the task supervisor, where would the student go for assistance and guidance? It's important that there's always someone there. One time I had a student who was at a school and it was only like his or her second week maybe. And there was a crisis at the school and the field instructor happened to have a sick child that day. And literally the staff at the facility looked to the student for guidance what to do during this crisis. And the student, obviously, and rightly so, did not know what to do because it was only the second week. And so it's important that the student knows who that person is to be able to look to staff and say, my field instructor isn't here, but she has put this person in charge. Please talk to him or her about this. Also, as I said before, looking at the upper limits of the student's role, making sure that they know within this agency what they can and what they can't do and what their role is. If they're in a school setting, their role isn't to have therapeutic sessions for an hour throughout the entire day with each student. Their role is to possibly do groups or be available for crisis. But it's not a mental health facility where they're a therapist seeing clients throughout the day 1 hour at a time. So it's important that you set those parameters and let the students know specific expectations. Obviously, early on in the practicum, the student tends to need more supervision more than that hour a week where the student has opportunities to ask you questions. Hopefully, independence with the student will grow and the student will need less frequent supervision throughout the week and can have some more and increased independence, as well as increased difficulty in what he or she is doing in practicum. Some of the continuous and ongoing items for discussion throughout the semester include discussing social work principles, looking at ethics, diversity, social and economic justice, looking at different theoretical perspectives and what those foundational perspectives are and how they're being applied in the setting that the student is in and in the work that the student is doing in that setting. Also, I have said before in the first recording that assessment should not just occur at the midterm and the final evaluation period, but should be continuing throughout the semester. So every week that you're meeting together, discuss that evaluation tool and discuss the progress that the student is making and how you can have additional experiences for the student in the areas where he or she is needing growth. Be sure to always review the learning plan with the student during those meetings to discover and track what items are being completed and what items still need to be completed by the end of the semester in order to achieve competence. If the student is going into a new type of situation with a client, or the student is working on a specific project and needs some guidance, you can talk about those projects and even role play for the student and with the student regarding how to proceed and expectations you have. Making sure that the student then feels more comfortable when he or she is going into the real situation and the real experience. Always follow up with the student on specific clients or projects or difficult cases, making sure to go over them very, very specifically. Don't let the student gloss over it and say, I'm working with this client, everything is going fine, I'm going to see them again next week. That really doesn't tell you the plan for that client or what the student interactions are with that client. And you're in charge of the student and those client interactions, and you want to be sure you know exactly what's going on with them so that you can provide the proper guidance and make sure that the student is progressing correctly, or if they are in over their head suddenly and something else has come up and now you need to take over, you'll only know that if you go into the specifics of each of those projects. And so it's very important that you push the student to provide those specifics to you during supervision. While we are trying to be diligent in ensuring that students are placed in agencies with MSWs whenever possible, there are times that students are placed with task supervisors, and perhaps you're a task supervisor listening to this recording now. Please, as the field instructor or task supervisor, continue to meet that hour a week for formal supervision. Even if your student is going to additional supplemental supervision with someone else because you're not an MSW, please go ahead and meet with that student for that hour a week just to make sure that you and the student are on the same page and you know the progress of the learning plan, which also helps you then assign the right type of work for the student. So please be sure that you're meeting with the student for that hour a week. The student will attend mandatory 2-hour biweekly additional supervision, which will typically be on Thursdays after classes. The student is allowed and should count that time in this additional supervision. So you will likely see a recording of that on the journal. And again, that is approved and should be counted during those field hours. Our accrediting body requires supervision to be from an MSW with 2 years of experience. It is for that reason that If you as a task supervisor do not have an MSW, that we have to provide this additional MSW supervision, and for that reason that time is counted. Hopefully that won't take away from your supervision, but instead will supplement what you are providing. We're thankful that our task supervisors do such a great job and are working hard to understand the social work role and to understand social work students. And if at any time you want any help with that, to understand that better, or to have more information about foundational theoretical perspectives, I'm happy to provide you with some reading or some additional information in that area. But again, we're very thankful to our task supervisors, as there are MSWs in every social services agency. And so we know that you're providing good opportunities for our students, and we want to continue that as much as possible. So let's just talk a little bit more about supervision and what it looks like to move from a clinical supervisor maybe, or an administrative supervisor, into a teaching role, a teaching supervisor, a teaching field instructor. So remembering that it is a different role being an instructor versus being an administrator or a boss over an employee. The student is going to make mistakes. That's why they're in this role, is to be able to make mistakes in a supported environment where they can learn and correct whatever they're doing incorrectly. So it's important that you are looking at it as a teacher versus a student being an employee. All students learn at their own pace. So you may have two students even at the same time, and one is much more independent in his or her work and in your confidence in that student seeing clients independently, whereas the other student may not be catching on as quickly, and you may still have to monitor that student a little closer. That's okay. There are not every student at midterm is at the same exact point. What you're looking for is continued growth and confidence that that student can reach competency by the end of the semester. I made that mistake once, thinking, I don't understand why this student is not at the same place that my previous 5 students were at midterm. We were further ahead. The student was much more independent, and this student is not, and so it's not going to work. It was important for me to understand that, looking at the big picture and the full semester, do I think the student can reach competency, or do I think the student cannot reach that competency? And even if he or she is learning at a slower rate, that doesn't mean that competency won't ultimately be reached. Now, there are some circumstances where you feel maybe that you have provided action steps and remediation in your teaching for a long time now, and you're not seeing any growth at all. And so you become concerned that competency won't be reached. And so that's a time when the faculty liaison does need to be contacted, and you can let the faculty liaison know that the student is not experiencing any growth, and because that's concerning, that the student won't reach competency. And so make sure that you let us know that. But if the student is continuing to gain some growth, just maybe at a little slower pace, then that's still acceptable. As I said before, these are student learners, not employees. If they make mistakes, that's expected and that's okay. When they've had 2 infractions, they're not automatically dismissed like an employee might be per your policy, because again, the student is not an employee. The student also should not have the same caseload as an employee or the same responsibilities of an employee because, again, he or she is not an actual employee. And so it's important that you make sure that these are student learners with time for processing and time for learning and room to make some mistakes. If there are some student concerns, it's important to address those in the moment. It's important to the student to have those addressed in the moment. It makes more sense to the student if it happens right then and there so that more learning can take place, and that can be an immediate feedback loop, rather than holding on to 3 or 4 different concerns for several weeks and then piling them onto the student at the same time, which can be very overwhelming and less specific and thus less meaningful to the student. So if you see a student concern, even if it's a small one, correct it in the moment so that they have an opportunity to fix that the next time and to not repeat that same mistake. I find often that field instructors think, oh, well, that's not going to happen again, so I'm not going to correct it. And then it does happen again and again and again. And then the field instructor does finally say something, but it's already midterm by the time that happens. And then there's lost opportunity for growth. And there's some frustration on the part of the student and the field instructor because the communication is much less specific and frequent. And there are miscommunications. The student thinks, I'm doing great. I haven't gotten any negative feedback at all. And the field instructor is thinking, I'm getting worried that they can't make it. And so now you're both on very different pages, and some severe and pretty serious misunderstandings start occurring. So make sure that you're giving that feedback in the moment. And making sure that that feedback is from a strengths perspective. You're being clear and consistent and supportive all the time, acknowledging that they're in a student role and that you expect them to make mistakes, and that it's okay that we've all made mistakes and we've all had to go through our own learning process, validating and normalizing what's going on with that, but also being critical and challenging and constructive. It's not helpful to the student to hear all semester, you're doing great, keep up the good work. They need to know where they need further growth. They need to know areas that they need to improve upon, as well as areas that they're exceeding expectations. So be both supportive, but also being critical and challenging and constructive when possible. Everyone wants to feel valued, and the student is no different. The student is always thinking, I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing it right. And so it's important for you to constantly be giving clear feedback in the moment to them so that the students can understand what's going on and can know, yes, I'm on the right page, or no, I'm not, and here's where I need to improve, and I am part of the team, and I am valued within this agency. We're going to briefly review the curriculum. For those of you that are BSWs or MSWs, it'll be a little bit of a refresher and help you understand how to help the student to make connections between what they've learned in class and what they're doing in practicum. We need to bridge that gap so that they understand that class wasn't one thing and it's over, and now I'm going to learn how to do it in real life. But so that they understand that what they have learned in classes is now being taken out and applied in a practice setting, but that there is a strong connection between those two, and they're using what they have learned. So for those of you that are BSWs or MSWs, you probably recognize some of these classes. For those of you that are task supervisors, it's important for you to also have this list in front of you so that you can say, is there anything that you've learned in an interaction skills workshop that might be helpful? If you go into our School of Social Work website also and go on to field education, and then on the left hand side there's different tabs. One of those is for field instructors, and And there's orientations as well. And on the bottom of the orientations page for field instructors, there are some basic resources. One of those talks about the different classes, as well as another that talks about the different theories that are learned in the classes. And so take some time to look at those resources. That will help you to understand more of the curriculum and, again, to help make those connections. So just going over briefly some of the classes, you have 2220, which is the human behavior and environment. Sometimes it's called human behavior in the social environment. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as HBSE or HIBSE. Those are your basic theories, your foundational theories of human behavior. So developmental theories, systems theories, etc. And the student will have to reference these a great deal in the journal. The student has to take a social statistics class. There's a social policy 1 and 2. There's the introduction to social work practice and the interaction skills workshop. Interaction skills is where they do a lot of their engagement and assessment skills and learning those basic listening and attending skills. Variations in human behavior is where they learn some about diagnoses and different groupings and different issues that humans face related to their behavior and related to personality. Community and organizational processes are more of that macro level social work intervention and assessment. We have group work, research, strategies of direct practice. So they'll look at, I don't know how many they actually look at, but it's about 6 or so different strategies like crisis theory, cognitive theory, those types, behavioral theory. They'll look at several different theories and learn about assessment as it relates to those specific theories. Research 2. Then while they're in practicum, they're also taking senior professional seminar. So those are the different classes. They'll actually be taking also 4770 in research while they're in field. And so talking to them about what strategy are you learning in your direct practice class right now that you might be able to use with the clients, that you might be able to use with the administrators in our agency. So looking at that and talking about those classes and what they're learning is helping the student and prompting the student to make those connections. It's important during supervision that you're helping the student make those connections. So as they're talking about their case with the client and what they've done during the assessment and their foundational intervention, having them make those connections. Say, okay, great work with that client. Can you tell me what you learned in your strategies class that you applied with this client? And so really pushing them to make and prompting them to make those connections is important. They don't happen on their own. It has to be a purposeful process. So field instructors and task supervisors are always a bit concerned about what happens if I have a student that is not progressing as I would like. So it's important to note 2 things, that yes, that does happen, and so we need to talk about it. And the second is that it does not happen very often. There are 1 or 2 or 3 students per semester typically that have issues that we have to have addressed. But 10% is about the typical, so we're pretty low compared to other programs in this area. But sometimes there are concerns, and so we want to make sure we talk to you about how to handle those. So that's what we'll do in this section. Student issues tend to be surrounding 3 different problem areas. The first of those is inadequate performance. So if the student is violating ethics, is not progressing with skills as you would expect, and thus you're concerned about reaching competencies, or is unprofessional in some way, or is not addressing or is having problems in one of the 10 areas of those learning goals and practice behaviors, then that is a concern of inadequate performance. There are also environmental issues that can occur, personality conflicts, just maybe the field instructor is more hands-off and expects the student to be more independent, whereas the student's preference of supervision style is more hands-on. And so there's a bit of a difficulty in the personality meshing and there being a good match between the field instructor and the student. Or often students will say the agency is not offering the opportunities that I thought existed at this agency or that we discussed in our interview. I had an agency one time that had the best of intentions, but some funding fell through, and so the project that they discussed at an interview in March no longer existed when practicum started in August, and that was the student's primary choice for choosing the agency, and so thus the student was a bit disenfranchised about what he or she would be doing at the practicum. And so sometimes that does happen, and sometimes the student has to be moved. The earlier we know that, the better, so that the student's graduation is not compromised and the learning can continue without being stopped in the middle of a practicum once that learning has started. So sometimes environmental issues such as that do exist, and we need to decide how disruptive that is for the student and for the agency, and how we need to respond to that. There are other situational things that happen. The students are people just like anyone else, as are you and other staff at the agency. They're just like funding falling through, or maybe you have to switch jobs suddenly, or a student's mom or dad gets sick, or the student gets sick. And so there are situational things like that that can happen during practicums, which I've had often, but we always try to make sure that after the illness or the crisis or whatever has happened is over, that we can accommodate the student and continue his or her learning toward graduation, whether that's that semester or another semester. Again, it's a case by case, and we have to decide. It depends on the kind of illness or crisis or whatever's happening and how long that's going to last and how disruptive that is. But they tend to focus around these three areas. 2 and 3 tend to be a little more defined and a little more specific. 1 is a little more difficult to tell, and field instructors and task supervisors tend to be a little less comfortable standing up and saying, this is not working. And so sometimes the school has to step in and say, I don't see the student making progress, and from what you're telling me, I'm going to terminate this practicum. And so sometimes it has to be the School of Social Work saying that, and we're fine with that. We can do that. We just want to give the student the best chance for success. And if things aren't working out, then we need to do something about that, because typically things don't get better, they deteriorate. So we need to address these issues early on if you see any of these things occurring. So for all of those problem areas, as I said, identifying them, and not only identifying them, but addressing them immediately is important. If you find that there's an issue that's serious enough to have an action plan, or serious enough to ask the student to change his or her behavior, then that's something that you need to let the faculty liaison know immediately that you are coaching the student on that issue, and especially if you're coaching them and there's no progress, we need to be notified about that immediately. Remember always that the client needs are the priority. So if you're concerned about a student continuing to meet with a client, then don't let them meet with that client. Or make sure that you are meeting with the student and the client together as a sort of buffer and backup plan. But the school supports you at any time saying, I don't feel that the clients, that you are ready to see clients individually at this point. And that's your decision, that's your agency, and that's your client, and so that's your choice. But doing so, you have to evaluate the student's skill level and look at that objectively to decide if the student is able to meet with clients or not. Providing support to the student, again, letting the student know that this is a learning process and you're willing to give the student a chance and to do some remediation and some additional work in order to bring the student to where he or she needs to be with progress. A corrective action plan needs to take place. Your manuals are online, also on that School of Social Work Field Education. Under student documents, there are manuals for each level of the student practicum, for BSW, for MSW Foundational, and for MSW Clinical and PPNA. So you can look in those manuals, and there are some sample corrective action plans. But it's important to, if your student is not making any progress and you need to have specifics about remediation with that student, about going back to some teaching and going over some things before you feel comfortable having the student move forward, then you need to have a corrective action plan. You can have a corrective action plan in any of those 3 areas that we talked about before. Perhaps the student is coming in late every day or is not showing up at all on some days, and you need to address that with the student, and you've told them twice and you're not seeing any progress. So now it's time for you to do basically a contract with the student or a corrective action plan, talking to them about, here's what you're going to do, here's what I'm going to do, and here's what will happen as we move forward. And so you'll say, student will contact field instructor 2 days before any planned absence. Student will contact field instructor by 9 a.m. if ill and not coming in that day, or whatever it might be. And field instructor will record and keep track of absences and monitor those on the journal. And then it can say, if student is again absent without notice 2 days in a row, practicum will be terminated, or faculty liaison will be called, and a special advisement will be held. And so making that corrective action plan is important because it outlines specifically in writing, leaving a paper trail of the student expectations, the student issues that have been occurring, and what will happen if certain steps are not taken. And this helps us to then deal with the student moving forward. We are happy to help you write these corrective action plans anytime you have an issue like this. You're not doing this by yourself. You just need to contact us and let us know what the issue has been, and then we can decide with you how to proceed. But again, we are available to you we can talk by email, we can talk by phone, and we can come to your agency for additional meetings if necessary. Another way that you can respond is to provide that evaluation and feedback and discuss those deficits. And so again, if you have talked about the evaluation and provided feedback in the moment each time these are occurring, a corrective action plan is not going to be a surprise to the student. and a subsequent possible special advisement meeting with the school is not going to be a surprise because you've been telling them every week or every other week that this behavior is not acceptable. And so that paper trail and that trail is very important to establish. We don't want to get to week 14 and say, I haven't been happy with your performance throughout, and now I suddenly feel like you can't reach competency. We want them to know each step of the way how things are progressing and if there are concerns or no concerns, or deficits or no deficits. And so we want the student to know at all times if we are feeling that there are significant deficits of any kind that need to be corrected. During this planning corrective action plan and during your discussions and feedback about deficits, the students may share some personal information with you. They may say, I'm coming in late every day because I'm having a significant amount of depression that's causing sleeplessness that is making me be late in the morning. And so that's some personal information that that student is sharing with you. This information is protected by FERPA. This information is related to their education and their schooling. This has to do with their performance in one of their classes, which is FieId. And so this is not information that should be shared freely with others during your lunch break or with other agencies throughout the community. This is information that's personal and that's related to the education. So just like there's HIPAA protection, there's FERPA protection for students. So please use discretion and remember confidentiality when dealing with student issues. The discussion again about the student and the field instructor creating the contract or the action plan, and how you're going to address those concerns. And again, that faculty liaison is available at any time for assistance. Please don't hesitate to call us. We would rather hear about it than to get blindsided along with the student further into the practicum and then have to decide what to do. All action plans must be documented. So if you're having issues with the student, please start a file. Please communicate via email, so that we have that specific paper trail to be able to document that. Just like you would with the client, we need to have that paper trail with our student. And then share that with the faculty liaison so that we know what's going on, and all three of us, the student, faculty liaison, and field instructor, and task supervisor, are all on the same page and understand what's happening. And then when the action plan is met or not met, we all know exactly where we're going and how to proceed with that because we're all in the same loop. So make sure that you're using that documentation at all times.